my name is Kyle, and we're chatting with you from Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Actually, I think most of us are at home now, but we are here representing Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And joining me are a few other Sandia scientists, Mariah Smith, Dan Clayton, and John Fulton. At Sandia, one of our key missions is to investigate the safety, the resilience, and sustainability for many aspects of nuclear energy. And this includes all aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle, safeguards, emergency planning, disposal, physical and cybersecurity, packaging, storage, transportation, non-proliferation, and so many other aspects of nuclear energy research. Our specific group, the Accident Consequence Modeling and Analysis group, has two main areas of work. One of those being what I'm going to talk to you about today quite a bit is the assessment of probabilistic risk associated with severe accidents at nuclear power facilities. And the other one of those being launch safety, where we predict the consequences associated with spaceflight accidents for spacecraft carrying nuclear payloads. In this capacity, we use our tools and our models to assess severe nuclear accident phenomenology and provide objective, science-backed reporting that is then used to inform decision makers. At Sandia, we're increasingly interested in the future of Arctic energy and Arctic nuclear energy, and the labs even recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the Port of Alaska to evaluate renewable energy and grid modernization and resilience in the Upper Cook Inlet. So that's pretty cool. So in all of that context, we appreciate the opportunity to offer our perspectives on environmental impact modeling in the Arctic, and specifically our computer code MAX that we've been maintaining for the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the last half century, so a pretty long time. And we think we can offer some valuable perspective on how codes like ours fit into the broader picture of ensuring safe, equitable use of nuclear energy in the Arctic. And so, briefly, I'll talk a little bit about MAX, which will provide some context into how existing modeling space using our code or others handles the prediction of nuclear accident consequences. The potential role of nuclear energy for the Arctic, for Arctic energy security, and some of the unique challenges associated with appropriately predicting nuclear accident consequences in Arctic regions compared to traditional environments. And then we can wrap up and hopefully between the four of us answer any questions or discussion. So we maintain a code called MAX, which used to be an acronym, but that acronym has since and fairly recently been dropped, and now it's just MAX. It's called MAX. And MAX is a sort of Swiss Army knife of consequence analysis. To explain at a high level what MAX does, I'll work my way clockwise around this graphic, starting at the light green polygon at roughly the 1 o'clock position. So what we can do with MAX is first gather information regarding nuclear reactor characteristics. This is things like what the fuel type is, the composition of the radionuclides, the physiochemical characteristics of the accident progression, and ultimately what we might expect to be released to the environment in a hypothetical or theoretical accident scenario. That's what we call a source term. This source term is generated by a combination of different precursor codes that we'd use before MAX. Essentially, it's a list of different radioactive chemicals that we might expect to be released in a hypothetical accident scenario and their associated concentration or activity. We can then take that source term and a number of other factors, such as the site meteorology, the release height, other parameters like that, and calculate the transport and dispersion of those radioactive chemicals through the environment. And so basically with a little bit of knowledge about the site, or by specifying a number of assumptions, we can predict where those radionuclides or chemicals are going once they're released. We can then take that, or rather Max can then take that atmospheric transport data and predict the radiation exposure and subsequently the dosimetry and the corresponding health effects to different cohorts of people around the accident scenario. And when I talk about health effects, I mean both acute injuries resulting from the accident, but then also long-term latent cancer risk. Fairly uniquely, Max also can take into account simulated evacuation and shielding, and even the ingestion of potassium iodide to counter the effects of radiation. Max also has a food chain model, which we call COMETA 2. That tells us how crops and animals are impacted by nuclear accidents. Often we discretize this type of data as a function of the radial distance outward from the accident. And one of the unique aspects of Max is that we can also provide statistical confidence for these results through probabilistic sampling of multiple weather trials. For instance, not just outputting a peak dose, but the probability that one receives that peak dose. Max can then also calculate the economic losses associated with immediate impacts of an accident. Consider, for instance, the cost of condemned land or structures or displaced populations out of work. Ultimately, the output of Max provides us a high fidelity, detailed picture of nuclear accident consequences. And it allows us to provide objective reporting on those consequences to inform regulatory frameworks, emergency preparedness measures, and other protective action recommendations. And so this is a cartoon of what a generic hypothetical accident might look like in a typical terrestrial environment. You have the unfortunate scenario of a nuclear accident and the subsequent release of nuclear material to the environment. You have parameters like wind and temperature causing the plume to rise and interact with the atmospheric conditions. And as the plume passes, you have this cyclist, unfortunately, perhaps inhaling some of the passing cloud. And as it deposits in the surrounding environment, you have folks also getting exposed to a certain amount of radiation. This man eating an apple and walking his dog may be ingesting some amount of radioactivity. And as I mentioned before, you have a number of people who are shielding in their homes or evacuating the area. And so Max provides a very detailed statistical calculation for all of these scenarios. And so this is a very not to scale timeline of that describes the nearly 50 years, the half century of development and significant financial investment that has gone into making sure that our code can accurately predict nuclear accident consequences. So back in the 70s, when we used the calculation of reactor accident consequence code, the crack code, for the landmark reactor safety study called WASH 1400. And in the 50 years since, there's been a number of iterations of that code that have led us to the Max code that we know and love today. Along the way, we developed an intuitive, user-friendly interface for Windows called WinMax. That made Max more accessible and easy to operate for the average user. The entire code suite is also equipped with an intermediary code called MELMAX, which allows us to translate source term data. If you recall, other softwares will produce a source term that we then use in our calculations. We developed a software called MELMAX, which allows us to interface those softwares with Max to take source term data from separate codes and make it into data readable by Max. All of these codes have had a lot of brilliant scientists and engineers working on them for several decades, and all of the associated financial investment that accompanies that work. And to sort of stress the importance of accident consequence analysis, I've just included some photos of famous reactor accidents. Why am I telling you all this? Well, we wanted to provide some context on where the energy future of the Arctic might be headed. We actually just returned from the DOE Arctic X Summit and the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, held in Anchorage, Alaska. And at these conferences, there was quite a bit of chatter from the scientific and Arctic energy communities about the role that nuclear may or is expected to play in a secure energy future for the Arctic. Particularly in the Arctic, many are looking towards nuclear for its smaller carbon footprint, its reliability. They tout its increased safety and increased affordability, which has implications for so many aspects of Arctic security, environmental security, economic security, energy security, and to many, nuclear, especially with these new advanced reactors, nuclear solves many of the issues associated with traditional renewables in the Arctic. There's even been meaningful headway in the development of niche technologies like mobile waterborne reactors. And so the point that we want to make here is that consequence analysis and probabilistic risk assessment is somewhat of an inevitability for these new technologies in the Arctic, and making sure that our models can handle the Arctic energy transition is an imperative to ensure this safe, equitable transition to nuclear energy that I mentioned before. And so we have a number of forward-looking ideas or updates to accident consequence codes like MAX that might benefit this transition. And so this graphic might look similar, but we remade it for what it might look like in an Arctic accident scenario. So what's different about a nuclear accident in the Arctic? Well, what if that reactor is instead placed offshore or on snow that's expected to melt? An accident here might cause releases into water and not just the air. The unique meteorology of the Arctic may cause variable transport and dispersion that we're not used to. We need to make sure that our ingestion and food chain models account for this man eating his fish just as well as they account for the man eating his apple in the previous graphic. Deposition characteristics may be entirely different for snow instead of rain, and evacuation routes may be blocked by snow or ice, or even extremely limited to begin with due to the available infrastructure. And so it's clear to us that Arctic environments present unique challenges for traditional consequence analyses using the available modeling space. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of those challenges. Floating reactors. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but floating reactors and other small modular or microreactors may play a significant role in the Arctic energy generation. Several countries and companies have already started to do this, and these companies tout the safer design, the mobility and flexibility of these reactor types. One major topic that we've heard discussed extensively in regards to Arctic energy in general is the role of microgrids in the Arctic, and the ability for nuclear power to power communities who may not be connected to a central utility. But from a risk modeler's perspective, these reactors don't come without challenges to the traditional modeling space. It will likely become important, for instance, to make sure that we can couple aqueous transport, how radionuclides move through the water, in addition to atmospheric transport, how they move through the air, to incorporate the effects of melting ice and snow, or the intense and variable washout that might be expected during an Arctic snowstorm. Implementing those changes will give risk assessors like us more accurate predictions unique to the Arctic. Arctic food chains. As I mentioned before, Max has a food chain model that models how radionuclides move through food chains. Arctic food chains may vary significantly from what you might consider a traditional food chain. Certain fruits and vegetables may be difficult to cultivate or import, and in some communities, food may be more reliant on, let's say, aquatic organisms, and thus those communities may be disproportionately impacted by an accident scenario, especially over water. The Arctic may be relatively isolated and more prone to disruption, and landlocked communities may rely on subsistence hunting more than you might expect in some of the more traditional terrestrial environments. This is just a sampling of food chain impacts unique to the Arctic, and I'm sure that we could come up with many others. But we wanted to make the point that that accident consequence codes and the appropriate assessment of nuclear accident risk in the Arctic should consider these. This might look like expanding how or which fruits and vegetables our model considers, expanding the categories of animals considered for meat or milk consumption, the weighting of different food groups more towards Arctic communities, or making sure that our models can accurately account for how radionuclides move through aquatic and Arctic wildlife. As I mentioned before, Max does have a robust food chain model built in, but would certainly benefit from these changes and others. The Arctic also certainly has unique socioeconomics, which may cause disproportionate socioeconomic impact in the event of an accident scenario. Consider, for instance, the often limited or habitable or farmable land in the Arctic, which might mean that in the event of an accident, an affected population can't simply move or farm elsewhere. Affected land may have a higher socioeconomic toll because it's a more significant fraction of the total land available overall. The current MAX model makes a cost effectiveness decision between condemning land or decontaminating that land based on the value of an area. Traditionally, when I say the word value in our models, that just means the property value. But what if an Arctic community is willing to spend money greater than the property value to restore certain areas and avoid having a permanently contaminated, restricted area? Some Arctic communities might also be highly localized. And so let's take a fishery as an example. If a fishery were interrupted due to an accident, that could affect entire livelihoods and food sources for an area. And so there is also this increased socioeconomic cost associated with the speed at which these communities can recover from an accident as well, as they often don't have the same resources and support, or they're relatively isolated. And so, as I mentioned before, existing evacuation infrastructure also may be inadequate and thus exacerbate socioeconomic loss in the event of an accident. An increasing area of research is also the impact of nuclear accidents on well-being. The impact on well-being may be disproportionate for Arctic community. It is not something that the traditional modeling space accounts for. And then even something as simple as making sure that our population models accurately reflect areas outside of the continental US. And so when we sample populations in a certain area, we need to make sure that the population data that we are pulling from is specific to the region that we are modeling. And so the MAX model we maintain, it does have a very robust economic impact model, but any accident consequence model might be better suited for the Arctic if it can account for these unique socioeconomics and the evacuation challenges that I mentioned, and the slower recovery and the disproportionate value of land in the Arctic. It goes somewhat without saying that the Arctic has highly variable and extremely challenging and unique meteorology. And given that meteorology is a critical input to our model and other accident consequence models, An Arctic-ready nuclear accident consequence model should account for that unique Arctic meteorology. So making sure that we can appropriately model things like how radionuclide transport behaves in ice fog, or dispersion from the near field from some of these reactors that are smaller, lower to the ground, or water-based, or that have variable heat signatures. Making sure that we can account for the impacts to plume rise. As you remember in that accident scenario cartoon, in a nuclear accident, those radionuclides are released and they interact with the wind and the temperature to interact with the atmosphere. We need to make sure that any impacts to that plume rise and the unique sort of dynamic nature that might be expected by Arctic weather conditions is appropriately captured by our models. In high latitudes, we might also expect significant seasonal variability in sun exposure, and thus vertical heat fluxes. When we were in Alaska, we came during the time where the sun didn't set, and that was a surprise for us. And so we need to make sure that our models can account for differences in insulation. And then just in general, differences in atmospheric transport properties based on the ground surface composition. That might be snow or ice instead of grass or forest. Another budding area of research in nuclear accident consequence analysis is the role of dose coefficients. Dose coefficients are basically experimentally derived values that allow us to translate a radionuclide intake. So say the cyclist on his bike inhaling radionuclides from the passing plume to an effective dose. And they rely broadly on the anatomy and the physiology of the human receptor and aspects such as gender or body weight. And so essentially, health physicists, they conduct studies to determine how radionuclides move through different organs in our body and the rate at which they clear from the respiratory system. And so that gives us a measurement of, say, you're exposed to X amount of radiation, that corresponds to Y amount of actual dose to a given organ. And then those doses then correlate to health effects. And so there is significant research interest in the nuclear risk modeling community about dose coefficients and making sure that they accurately apply to the communities that are actively being modeled, and not just we'll say a default human per se. And so the use of inappropriate dose coefficients may cause inaccurate estimates of risk. And so we think that investment into this research area and the changes necessary to incorporate accurate dose coefficients into existing modeling space is important for a potential nuclear Arctic. Okay, so we got to chat about the importance of probabilistic risk assessment in the context of nuclear energy in the Arctic. And we had the opportunity to discuss some forward-looking ideas that we had for ensuring that, at least from a risk modeling community perspective, any use of nuclear in the Arctic is done in a way that ensures the security of so many aspects of the Arctic, culturally, economically, energy, environmentally, food, health, or other. Investment into MAX and other models like it can help us anticipate a nuclear Arctic by ensuring that we accurately account for new reactor technology and the unique aspects of the Arctic food chain, socioeconomics, meteorology, Arctic populations, and others. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of potential improvements to nuclear accident consequence modeling that might benefit the Arctic. And so we're happy to hear what input the audience might have as well. And so we appreciate you listening to our perspectives, and we're happy to take any questions or discussion.